Picture this. You are standing in a field in southern Poland. April 9th, 1241. The sky above you is the color of old iron. Gray, heavy, pressing down like a lid on a pot that's about to boil over. The ground is still cold from winter. You can feel it through the leather soles of your boots, that deep, bone-aching cold that Central European spring never quite manages to shake off in time. Around you, thousands of men, knights in chainmail, their crosses painted on white surcoats, their horses breathing steam in the morning air, foot soldiers gripping spears with white knuckles, monks praying on their knees in the mud. And in front of you, beyond the ridge, a sound you have never heard in your life and will never forget. A low, rising thunder, not from the sky, from the earth itself. From 30,000 hooves moving in perfect formation. You don't know what it is at first. Nobody does. That's the thing about the Mongols. They arrive like weather. They arrive like something that was always coming, and you were simply too foolish to prepare. The man standing beside you is Henry II, Duke of Silesia. His people call him Henry the Pious, a young nobleman, devout, brave, and utterly convinced that God is on his side today. He raises his lance. He shouts something in Latin, something about faith, something about courage. And then the Mongols come over that ridge like a wave crashing over a sandcastle. And within 3 hours, Henry the Pious will be dead. His head mounted on a lance, his army annihilated, and the gates of Western Europe will be wide open to the greatest conquering force in human history. This is where our story starts, in defeat, in smoke and ash and total humiliating catastrophe. But here's the thing, and this is why you need to stay with me for every single minute of this. That defeat doesn't end Poland. It transforms it. Like iron being hammered into steel. Like a man broken by the worst thing imaginable, who then gets back up and decides, never again. 47 years later, in 1288, those same Mongols, or rather, their descendants and successors, still carrying that same arrogance, that same terrifying reputation, will come back to Poland, expecting an easy prey. And they will walk straight into something they never saw coming. Think about that for a second. 47 years, nearly half a century of waiting, suffering, rebuilding, learning. And then one moment, one decisive, stunning reversal that shocked the Mongol commanders and echoed through history. Before we go any further, I want to do something. Look at where you're watching this from right now. Wherever you are in the world, whether you're in Warsaw or London, in Kraków or Chicago, in Manila or Lagos, drop a comment and tell me. Because the story I'm about to tell you shaped the world you're living in right now. The walls that held, the minds that adapted, the people who refused to become a footnote. And if you want more history like this, battles that changed civilization, stories that schools never bother to teach, hit that subscribe button. We're just getting started, and I promise you this ride is worth every minute. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Let's go back to the moment before the storm. Here is what most history teachers skip. The Mongol invasion of Poland in 1241 was not a border skirmish. It was not a regional conflict between rival kingdoms fighting over a patch of farmland. What it was, what it actually genuinely represented, was the single most terrifying military campaign to ever threaten the existence of European civilization in the medieval era. Let that sentence sit with you for a moment. We talk about existential threats in history with such casual ease. The Huns, the Vikings, the plague. But the Mongols in 1241 were something different. Something operating on a completely different scale of organized, systematic, coldly calculated destruction. In the decade leading up to their arrival in Poland, they had annihilated the Khwarezmian Empire, a sophisticated Islamic civilization of 30 million people, in 3 years. They had burned Beijing. They had turned the Rus kingdoms of what is now Russia and Ukraine into ash and silence, city after city. Ryazan, Vladimir, Kiev, all of them gone. Not defeated, not occupied, erased. Kiev, which at its peak had been one of the grandest cities in Europe, was reduced to a ghost. A Franciscan friar named Giovanni da Pian del Carpine passed through it in 1246, just 5 years after the Mongols came through, and he described a landscape of bones, skulls in the fields, buildings collapsed into rubble, a population of perhaps 50,000 people reduced to a few hundred hiding in the ruins. That is what was marching toward Poland in the spring of 1241. And here is the civilization-level stakes question. If the Mongols had not been stopped, if no battle had ever turned against them, if no European force had ever made them pay a price, what would the world look like today? Paris would have burned. Rome would have burned. The great universities of Oxford and Bologna, the manuscripts being preserved in 1,000 monasteries, the legal traditions, the cultural inheritance of Rome and Greece filtering through medieval Christianity, all of it potentially scattered and destroyed. This isn't speculation for dramatic effect. The Mongols were already planning the next campaigns. Batu Khan and his generals had discussed reaching the Great Sea, the Atlantic Ocean. They had riders on the western horizon. They had scouts in Germany and Hungary. The campaign in Poland in 1241 was not an end destination. It was a corridor, a highway through which the full force of the Mongol Empire was going to pour into the soft, fractured, bickering heart of Europe. The Battle of Legnica was not supposed to be a stand. It was supposed to be another obstacle cleared, another army broken, another dukedom absorbed. But something began to shift. Slowly, painfully, over 47 years. And in 1288, the Mongols found out exactly what that shift had produced. To understand 1241, you have to understand what Europe looked like before the storm arrived. Medieval Poland in the early 13th century was a fragmented, complicated mess. And I mean that in the most historically precise way possible. The old Pious dynasty had ruled a unified Polish kingdom, but by the 1200s, that unity was a memory. The kingdom had been divided among various dukes and princes, Silesia, Mazovia, Greater Poland, Lesser Poland, all technically part of the same cultural and ethnic identity, but politically operating as separate power centers, often more interested in fighting each other than in coordinating any common defense. This was the fundamental weakness, not cowardice, not lack of skill, not absence of fighting spirit. Political fragmentation, the inability to speak with one voice when one voice was desperately needed. The Holy Roman Empire to the west was in its own perpetual state of crisis. Emperor Frederick II was locked in a brutal, grinding conflict with the papacy that consumed his attention and resources. Pope Gregory IX had actually excommunicated Frederick twice. The two most powerful institutions in Western Christendom were at each other's throats at precisely the moment a unified response to the Mongols was most urgently needed. In Hungary, King Bela IV had done what kings do when confronted with uncomfortable intelligence reports. He had largely ignored the early warnings about Mongol movements. He had absorbed thousands of Cuman refugees fleeing west ahead of the Mongol advance, which destabilized his own kingdom and created internal tensions that would prove catastrophically distracting at the worst possible moment. Meanwhile, to the east, across the vast steppes of Russia and Ukraine, Something had been building for 3 decades. Genghis Khan. The very name carries weight even now, 8 centuries later. Born Temujin, possibly around 1162, into a clan that was itself barely surviving. His father murdered by rivals, his family abandoned, the young Temujin spending years as a slave and an outcast before beginning his long, brutal, methodical climb to total power. By 1206, the assembled tribes of Mongolia had given him the title Genghis Khan, roughly meaning universal ruler, and he had set about earning that title in the most literal possible way. What made the Mongol military machine so devastating was not simply raw numbers. Other armies had numbers. What the Mongols had was a level of organizational sophistication, tactical flexibility, and strategic planning that was genuinely ahead of its time by several centuries. They communicated across vast distances using a relay system called the Yam, a network of horse stations spaced 25 miles apart, capable of carrying messages across thousands of miles in days rather than weeks. They conducted intelligence operations before every major campaign, sending spies and traders into target regions years in advance. They adapted their tactics to every environment they encountered. In China, they learned siege warfare, building catapults and mining walls. In the steppes, they perfected mobile cavalry warfare. In forested terrain, they developed strategies for channeling and isolating enemy forces. By 1241, Genghis himself was dead. He died in 1227, but his legacy was the engine. His son Ogedei Khan sat on the throne in Karakoram, and his grandson Batu Khan commanded the Western Army, the Golden Horde, with the brilliant Subutai serving as strategic architect. Subutai, remember that name. He was perhaps the greatest operational military genius of the medieval world, a man who personally planned campaigns covering thousands of miles, who coordinated multiple army columns across entire continents, and who in his career defeated 32 nations and won 65 battles without a single significant defeat. These were the men who looked at the map of Europe in 1240 and decided it was time. Think about that. Think about the arrogance, the confidence, the sheer terrifying competence it takes to look at an entire continent and say, "Yes, we'll take that." Let me tell you exactly what the Mongol army that invaded Poland in 1241 was capable of, because I want you to feel the weight of what the Polish forces were facing. I want you to understand that this wasn't a bad dream from which you could wake up. The Western Mongol campaign of 1241 was a masterpiece of strategic planning. Subutai divided his forces into multiple columns, designed to strike simultaneously across a vast front, preventing any European kingdom from rallying its neighbors in time. Think of it as a military version of a power outage. Hit enough nodes at once, and the whole grid goes dark. One column under Orda and Baidar, approximately 20 to 30,000 strong, drove northwest into Poland. Their job was not actually conquest. Their job was disruption, to pin down the Polish forces, prevent them from moving south to reinforce Hungary, destroy as much as possible, and then link up with the main force. It was a fixing operation executed with frightening efficiency. The main force under Batu Khan and Subutai, perhaps 80 to 100,000 strong, drove straight into Hungary, the real target. Bela IV's kingdom was the primary prize. But first, the Polish flank had to be secured. The Mongols moved with a speed that was simply incomprehensible to European armies of the era. While medieval European knights were logistical nightmares, requiring massive supply trains, dependent on forage, slowed by their heavy armored horses, Mongol cavalry could cover 60 to 80 miles per day when necessary. Each rider typically maintained 3 to 5 horses, rotating between them constantly, keeping the animals fresh. They carried dried meat and fermented mare's milk, kumis that sustained them without the need to stop and cook. They could operate in temperatures that sent European soldiers reaching for blankets. They could cross rivers using inflatable leather sacks. They could navigate using stars and landmarks across terrain that European scouts had never mapped. Their tactical doctrine was built around deception and misdirection. The feigned retreat, in Mongolian, the Mongudai tactic, was perhaps their most devastating weapon. A Mongol force would engage the enemy, apparently begin to lose, and then turn and flee. European knights, trained in a culture that equated pursuit with victory, would break formation and charge after them. The Mongols would then split left and right. The fleeing force would turn around, and the pursuing knights found themselves surrounded on three sides by fresh cavalry pouring in from flanking positions they hadn't even known existed. The encirclement, the classic Mongol killing ground, would close, and that was the end. This tactic had worked against the Cumans on the Russian steppe. It had worked against the armies of the Khwarezmian Shah. It had worked against the Jurchen Jin dynasty in China. It had worked against every army it had been tried against, because armies trained in conventional warfare instinctively do not recognize the trap until they're already in it. Before they even reached the Polish border in early 1241, the Mongol northern column had already destroyed Lublin and Zawichost, burned Sandomierz, one of the great trading cities of the Polish interior, and crushed a Polish force under the voivode Włodzimierz at the Battle of Tursk. Word traveled ahead of them. Refugees clogged the roads. People took what they could carry and ran west. There are chronicles from this period describing people arriving in German cities with nothing but the clothes on their bodies, speaking in hollow, shattered voices of cities reduced to embers, of wells choked with bodies, of roads lined with the dead. In this psychological environment, in this atmosphere of total cascading terror, the Polish dukes made the decision that would define this chapter of their history. They would fight. Not wisely, perhaps, not with a unified strategy or a coordinated plan, but they would fight. And at Legnica, on April 9th, 1241, they paid the ultimate price for it. Henry II, Duke of Silesia, assembled the largest force he could manage. Polish knights from Silesia, Greater Poland, and the military orders, including Templars and the Teutonic Knights. Perhaps 15,000 to 25,000 men in total. He was expecting reinforcements from King Wenceslaus I of Bohemia, who was reportedly just a day's march away with 50,000 men. That cavalry was coming. It just needed to arrive. It didn't arrive in time. On the morning of April 9th, the armies met on a field near Legnica, in German Liegnitz, in Lower Silesia. The town itself huddled behind its walls as Henry led his forces out to meet the Mongols in open battle. Why open battle? Because that's what knights did. You rode out. You formed your lines. You charged. You trusted in God and the weight of armored cavalry to decide the issue. It was how wars had always been fought in Europe. Against any European opponent, it might even have worked. It did not work against Subutai's veterans. The battle began with Mongol light cavalry harassing the Polish flanks with arrows, drawing the knights forward. The Polish knights, disciplined in the medieval European tradition, held their formation for a while. And then the Mongols did something that nobody had ever seen before. They deployed a kind of smoke, possibly from burning materials or chemical mixtures, records are unclear, that confused and disoriented the Polish lines. And then came the feigned retreat. One account describes a Mongol rider shouting in Polish, or something approximating Polish, the word uciekajcie, run, run, designed to cause panic. Whether this is accurate or legendary embellishment, the psychological effect of the Mongol tactics was devastating. The Polish lines fragmented. Knights charged forward in pursuit of retreating Mongols. And then, the flanks closed. Henry II fought personally. He fought until his horse was killed under him, until he was on foot, until he was surrounded. He died there, in the mud and the screaming chaos. And when the battle was over, the Mongols cut off his head and mounted it on a spear and carried it to the walls of Legnica itself, displaying it to the garrison as proof of what had happened. They collected the ears of the Christian dead on that field. 9 large sacks, by some accounts. Left them as a monument, left them as a message. And then they turned south and rode to join the main force in Hungary. They had not come to stay. Not yet. But the damage was done. Poland was burning. Its finest army was destroyed. Its most capable duke was dead. The roads west were open. Nothing stood between the Mongols and the Rhine. And then, in one of those pivotal moments that history occasionally produces without explanation, they stopped. In December 1241, Ögedei Khan died in Karakorum. The Mongol imperial law required all senior commanders to return to Mongolia for the election of a new great Khan. Batu Khan, who was himself a candidate, had his own political reasons for pulling back. The Western campaigns were suspended. The army turned east. Europe had been saved not by its own strength, not by a brilliant counter-strategy or a legendary military genius. It had been saved by an accident of timing, the death of a ruler on the other side of the world. Let that sink in. Poland, battered and bleeding, had bought perhaps the most important 47 years in its history. And in those 47 years, something remarkable was going to happen. Not loudly, not with fanfare or celebration, but steadily, quietly, stubbornly. The way that real change always happens, Poland was going to learn. The trauma of 1241 did not break the Polish nobility and its military class. It educated them, slowly, painfully, through years of looking at the ruins of what Mongol cavalry could do to cities built without proper defenses, through years of studying the after-action reports, the oral histories, the accounts of survivors. The Polish cities began to change. Stone walls replaced wooden palisades. Towers were built higher and thicker. Supply caches were established in defensible positions. Communication networks, crude by Mongol standards but functional, began to develop between towns and fortresses. The Mongols came back in 1259. They burned through Poland again. Kraków fell a second time. The lesson was painful, but it was learned, because after 1259, the reconstruction was even more systematic. Wrocław, Kraków, Sandomierz, all of them rebuilt with stone walls, proper garrisons, and defensible keeps. And there was something else changing, something harder to quantify but equally important. The psychology of fear was shifting. The Mongols had come twice and left twice. They were terrifying. They were devastating. But they were not divine. They were not unstoppable forces of nature. They were a military organization with a doctrine, with strengths and weaknesses, with a way of operating that could, if you studied it long enough and were willing to think unconventionally, be countered. A generation of Polish commanders was growing up with this understanding in their bones. Not abstract book knowledge, lived experience. Scar tissue. The kind of wisdom that only comes from getting hurt badly enough to truly, permanently change. Imagine standing in Kraków in the 1270s, looking at those new stone walls, feeling the weight of 47 years of effort, 47 years of not forgetting, 47 years of never again, transformed into mortar and limestone and strategic patience. The Mongols would come a third time, and Poland would be ready. The year 1287. Nogai Khan and Talabuga, commanders of the Western Golden Horde are planning their third major invasion of Poland. Nogai is one of the most powerful figures in the Mongol world at this point, a general of enormous reputation, a man who has intimidated and manipulated rulers from Constantinople to the Pontic steppe. He controls vast territories. He commands tens of thousands of veteran cavalry. And he looks at Poland and sees what his predecessors saw, a fractured, second-tier European kingdom that should pose no serious military challenge. He has reason to think this. In 1259, the Mongols had burned through Poland essentially unopposed. The Duke of Kraków at the time had actually fled the city rather than defend it. The great church of St. Andrew, with its stone towers, one of the few buildings to survive the 1241 sack, had once again sheltered civilians, while Mongol cavalry poured through the streets outside. If you're Nogai in 1287, you look at the pattern and you see a prey animal that runs when you arrive. You see a kingdom that hasn't fundamentally changed its behavior. You've heard, perhaps, that the Poles have been building stone walls. But stone walls don't frighten Mongol armies. They have engineers now. They've been besieging fortified cities since the campaigns in China. They have siege equipment and tactics. A few upgraded walls don't change the strategic calculation. What Nogai doesn't know, what he cannot know, because his intelligence network, for all its sophistication, cannot measure the psychological shift that has occurred inside the Polish military mind, is that something fundamental has changed. There is a man in Kraków named Leszek II, Duke of Kraków, called Leszek the Black. He is not a legendary figure. He does not have the charisma of a Charlemagne or the military brilliance of a later Władysław. But he has something equally valuable. He has been paying attention. He has studied what happened in 1241. He has studied what happened in 1259. He has watched the walls go up around his cities. And unlike his predecessor, who fled in 1259, Leszek has decided he will not run. More importantly, there is an emerging class of Polish military commanders who have absorbed the lessons of two Mongol invasions and built a doctrine specifically designed to counter Mongol tactics. They have understood the feigned retreat. They know not to pursue. They have understood the importance of fortified positions that force the Mongols to either besiege, which takes time and resources, or bypass, which leaves a flanking threat. They have understood that the Mongol logistical system, brilliant as it is, has a constraint. The Mongols need to forage, to move, to keep the army fed through constant forward momentum, pin them down, make them besiege, deny them the open field mobility that is their primary advantage. And then there is something else. Something deeply human, and therefore deeply important. The insult. When Nogai's forces crossed into Polish territory in late 1287, they did so with the casual arrogance of men who had done it twice before without consequence. They ravaged the countryside. They burned villages. They were sending a message, not just a military message, but a political and psychological one. We own this space. You exist at our sufferance. We come and go as we please, and you cannot stop us. That message, delivered again after 47 years of quiet rebuilding, ignited something in the Polish defenders. There is a moment when humiliation transforms into resolution, when the weight of accumulated insults becomes not a source of despair, but a source of cold, determined, unbreakable fury. The Poles defending Kraków in 1288 were not fighting for glory. They were not fighting for honor in the abstract chivalric sense. They were fighting because they were done being burned, done being occupied, done watching their cities reduced to ash while their leaders fled. Done. That emotional shift is not a footnote. It is the engine of everything that follows. Let me walk you through exactly what happened at Kraków in 1288, because this is where the Polish adaptation becomes visible, becomes concrete, becomes real. The Mongol force that arrived before Kraków in the winter of 1287 to 1288 was substantial. Estimates vary, but likely between 10 and 30,000 strong. A raiding and coercion force, rather than a full conquest army, designed to extract tribute, demonstrate dominance, and devastate the surrounding territory. This was actually a key factor. The Mongol commanders were not expecting a serious fight. They were expecting the same pattern as 1259, some resistance, some fleeing, some burning, then withdrawal with loot and hostages. Kraków had different plans. The city's defensive preparations were now genuinely formidable. The old wooden stockades were replaced with stone walls, reinforced with towers at regular intervals, a design that eliminated blind spots and allowed defenders to provide overlapping fields of fire along the wall faces. The castle on Wawel Hill, which dominates the city, had been significantly reinforced, and critically, the garrison had not fled. The defenders were dug in, supplied, and ready. Think of the defensive logic here in modern terms. If you are a military strategist and you face an enemy whose primary advantage is speed and mobility, what do? You take away their room to maneuver. You force them to fight on your terms, on ground of your choosing. You turn a war of movement into a war of position, where their speed is irrelevant and their logistics, always stretched in deep strike operations, become a vulnerability. You make them besiege you, because siege warfare is slow, expensive, and exposes the attacking force to counterattack. That's exactly what the Polish defenders of Kraków did. The Mongols arrived and found a city that wasn't running. They began their standard operational sequence, raiding the surrounding countryside to deny the city resupply, harassing the walls with cavalry, probing for weaknesses. This was the template that had worked in China, in Persia, in Russia. Weaken the garrison psychologically. Create a sense of isolation and despair. Then, either starve them out or breach the walls. But the garrison held. Day after day, the stone walls absorbed what the Mongols threw at them. The defenders used the towers to repel cavalry that approached too close. And with every passing day, the Mongol timetable was disrupted. Here is the logistical reality. A Mongol raiding force operating deep in enemy territory cannot sustain a prolonged siege indefinitely. They can forage, but in winter, and 1287 to 1288 was a hard winter in this region. The surrounding Polish countryside had been stripped or hidden, the people evacuated behind walls, the livestock driven away. The Mongol horses need grass or grain, the soldiers need food. The further you are from your base of operations, and the longer the campaign extends, the more precarious your supply situation becomes. And there is another factor. The terrain of Poland, particularly in the south, in the Małopolska region where Kraków sits, is not steppe. It is a landscape of rivers, forests, hills, and valleys. The Kraków area specifically is defined by the Vistula River to its south and the Wawel Hill fortress above it. Cavalry that tried to operate in force around the city found their room to maneuver constrained, their ability to concentrate mass reduced, their flanks exposed to sorties from defenders who knew every path and ford. Meanwhile, outside the city, something was assembling. Polish forces, cavalry, and infantry from the surrounding region, commanded by local nobles who had been alerted to the Mongol approach, were gathering in the forested hills and valleys around Kraków. They were not powerful enough to challenge the Mongol army in open battle, but they didn't need to be. They were there to harass, to hit supply parties, to ambush isolated detachments, to deny the Mongols the freedom of movement they needed to sustain operations. In modern military terminology, this would be called an economy of force operation. small units tying down a larger force, forcing it to divert attention and resources from its main objective. This combination, the fortified city refusing to fall, the mobile harassment forces denying free movement, was something Mongol commanders in Poland had not encountered in their previous campaigns. In 1241, open battle. In 1259, an empty city. Now, a city with teeth and claws, backed by a countryside that fought back. Think about that evolution. 47 years to go from, we didn't know how to fight this enemy, to, we designed a defensive system specifically tailored to counter their strengths. That's not just military adaptation, that's institutional learning. That's the kind of transformation that happens when a civilization decides it will survive. The Mongols were patient. They had besieged cities before. They had sat outside walls for months. They had the discipline and the logistical experience to sustain operations longer than most of their opponents could endure. But in Poland, in 1288, the variables were working against them in ways their commanders were slow to recognize. The winter was becoming a constraint. The horses, those magnificent, carefully bred, irreplaceable Mongolian steppe horses, each warrior's most critical piece of equipment, were suffering. The forage was poor, the cold was severe, and unlike on the open steppe where Mongol horses could paw through snow to reach frozen grass underneath, the terrain around Kraków offered less grazing possibility. Animals were losing condition. A cavalry force with deteriorating horses is not a cavalry force anymore. It's infantry waiting to be outrun. The supply lines stretching back east were long and increasingly vulnerable. The Polish harassment forces, growing in confidence and coordination as the siege extended, were making it costly to send foraging parties out in small numbers. Larger foraging parties meant diverting combat troops from the siege perimeter, weakening the investment of the city itself. Every decision the Mongol commanders made was a compromise, a trade-off they hadn't needed to make in earlier campaigns. And psychologically, this is critical. The Mongol forces were not behaving like a victorious army. They were stuck. The city they had come to overawe was still standing, still defiant, still flying its banners from those stone towers. In a world where reputation was a military asset, where the terror of Mongol invincibility was itself a weapon that caused armies to break before battle was even joined, every day that Kraków held was a crack in the legend. The Mongol commanders were facing a choice that they had rarely been forced to confront: press the siege and risk deepening losses in a campaign that was not going according to plan, or withdraw. In their overconfidence, in their certainty that this was the same Poland they had burned twice before, they underestimated how long they could be held in place. They underestimated how thoroughly the defenders had prepared. They underestimated the quality and determination of the Polish mobile forces operating in the surrounding countryside. Overconfidence is not an emotion. It's a calculation error. It happens when you update your threat assessment based on past performance and fail to account for the changes your enemy has made, specifically because of those past performances. The Mongols knew what Poland looked like in 1241 and 1259. They did not know what Poland had become in the intervening decades. They were about to find out. Build tension here, because this is where the trap begins to close. Not with a dramatic single moment. Not with a trumpet call and a cavalry charge over the hill. Slowly, incrementally. Day by day, as the mathematics of the siege shifted against the attackers. As the cold deepened, as the horses weakened, as the supply parties became more contested, as the city refused to fall. The hunters were becoming the hunted, and they hadn't realized it yet. Imagine being one of those Mongol cavalry commanders on a gray January morning in 1288, standing in the cold outside Kraków, looking at those walls that should have crumbled by now, listening to reports of ambushed supply columns, watching your horses lose weight, feeling the campaign slipping, not dramatically, not suddenly, but like sand running through your fingers. Something is wrong. Something about this place is different from the last time you were here. What do? You retreat. And then the reversal begins. When the Mongol forces began their withdrawal from Kraków, the exact date is not recorded with precision, but sources place it in early 1288, after weeks of unsuccessful siege operations. They did not retreat as a victorious army on its own schedule. They retreated because the cost-benefit calculation had inverted, because Kraków had not fallen, because the campaign had failed to achieve its primary objective. And the Polish forces were ready for exactly this moment. A retreating Mongol force is a different animal from one advancing. The discipline of the withdrawal, the management of the horses, the protection of the flanks, all of this requires the same organizational excellence that made Mongol armies great in the attack, but a force that has been weakened by weeks of difficult operations in winter, that is managing deteriorating horses and contested supply lines. That is withdrawing through hostile territory, where the locals know every road and ford and forest path. That force is vulnerable. The Polish mobile forces, the cavalry and infantry, who had been harassing the siege from the surrounding hills and forests, now shifted from economy of force to active pursuit and interdiction. They hit the Mongol rearguard repeatedly. They ambushed columns at river crossings. They struck at night when the Mongol camps were less able to concentrate their response. Every engagement was not a pitched battle. The Poles were too smart for that. It was harassment, attrition, making the withdrawal costly, slow, and bloody. At the Battle of Kraków in 1288, the name applied to the whole campaign, including the siege and subsequent actions. Something decisive happened. Sources from the period describe a significant engagement in which Polish forces under Leszek the Black attacked and badly mauled a Mongol column. The specific details vary by source, and as with many medieval battles, the accounts blend into each other. But the core fact is consistent. The Mongols suffered a serious reverse. They lost men and horses they could not easily replace. Officers died. Units were broken. For the first time in Polish-Mongol interaction, the Poles had not merely survived a Mongol incursion. They had imposed costs on it. They had made the attackers pay a price. And in the brutal mathematics of medieval military reputation, that distinction mattered enormously. The Mongol force withdrew east. Short sentences now, because this is the rhythm of what happened. Kraków stood. The walls held. The garrison did not flee. The countryside fought back. The siege failed. The most feared cavalry force in the world left Polish territory without achieving their objective, without the intimidating political submission they had come to extract, without the demonstration of dominance they had intended to project, without, in the most fundamental military sense, winning. And then, in a moment that would have seemed completely impossible to anyone standing at that April morning in 1241, watching Henry the Pious die, the Poles pursued. They went after the retreating force. They hit them again. They made the withdrawal of the world's most feared cavalry army into something they had to fight their way through. Let that image stay with you for a moment. The men who burned Kraków, the descendants of the riders who collected Christian ears in sacks. Retreating through a Polish winter, being harassed and attacked by a people they had considered prey. 47 years of never again. Right there. Made real. The Mongols never again invaded Poland in force. Read that again. because it's extraordinary. After 1288, after the failure of the third invasion, the Mongol and later Tatar successor states would continue to raid the eastern marches of Poland for centuries. But never again did they mount a major invasion with the objective of conquest or fundamental subjugation. The calculation had changed. Poland was no longer a soft target. The cost had proven too high. There were easier places to raid, easier tribute to extract. The immediate military consequence was real, but limited. A single campaign's failure does not end an empire. And the Golden Horde remained a major power for another century. But the psychological and strategic consequence was profound. Poland had proven something. Not to the world. The world in 1288 barely noticed. As medieval communications being what they were, the failure of a Mongol raid in Central Europe did not generate the kind of international headlines that a modern military success would. But Poland proved it to itself. And in the long run, what a civilization believes about itself matters more than what the outside world thinks. The stone walls built in the aftermath of 1241 did not just stop Mongol cavalry. They stopped the narrative of Polish helplessness. They demonstrated that adaptation was possible, that the pattern of defeat was not destiny, that the lesson of humiliation, taken seriously and acted upon over decades, could be transformed into genuine defensive competence. Think about the institutional memory that carried this transformation. The craftsmen who had cut the stone and mortared the walls of the new Kraków fortifications. The commanders who had studied Mongol tactics and developed counter-doctrines. The ordinary soldiers who had held the walls through that winter siege and not run. These people were not heroes in the Hollywood sense, not individuals whose names we can all recite. They were communities, institutions, bureaucracies of survival, the rebuilding of Polish cities after the Mongol invasions. And I want to be specific here, because this is a physical fact you can verify today in any Polish city. Created an urban architecture that was fundamentally different from the pre-Mongol period. Brick and stone replaced wood. Towers were built with interlocking fields of fire. Streets were laid out to allow defensive forces to move quickly. The physical shape of Polish medieval cities was permanently altered by the lessons of Mongol warfare. Walk through Krakow's Old Town today, one of the best preserved medieval city centers in all of Europe, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And you are walking through the physical legacy of that adaptation. Those streets, those walls, that castle on Wawel Hill, they exist in that form because the people who built them had learned, at enormous cost, exactly what they needed to withstand. There is a larger historical irony in this story that deserves a moment of reflection. The Mongols, in destroying so much of what they conquered, also taught their victims. The kingdoms and cities that survived Mongol pressure, Poland, Hungary, portions of the Holy Roman Empire, emerged from the experience changed in ways that made them, paradoxically, stronger. They had been forced to solve problems, defensive architecture, rapid communication, coordination between otherwise fractious political units that they might never have solved in comfortable peacetime. The threat had imposed a discipline that prosperity never would have. And Poland specifically, Poland that would not formally reunify as a kingdom until 1320 under Władysław I. Poland that would face the Teutonic Knights and the Lithuanians and the Czechs and the Germans and every other neighbor before it emerged as a major European power in the 14th and 15th centuries, carried forward from the Mongol crucible something invaluable, a stubborn, earned, bone-deep understanding that survival is not given. It is built, it is chosen, it is maintained, generation by generation, through deliberate effort and the willingness to learn from failure. The Battle of Legnica in 1241 was a catastrophe. There is no softening that truth. Henry the Pious died. Thousands of men died. The cream of Polish chivalry was destroyed in an afternoon. The city of Kraków was burned for the first of what would be 2 times. But catastrophe is not the same as final defeat. Catastrophe is what happens when your current approach meets a problem it cannot solve. What comes after the catastrophe, whether you lie down in the ash or stand up and start asking why, that is the part that actually determines your future. The Poles stood up. They asked why. They spent 47 years building answers, and in 1288, those answers held. Here is what I keep coming back to when I think about this story. Not the battles themselves, as spectacular and dramatic as they are, but what sits underneath them. The human decision-making, the choice made in the shadow of catastrophic failure to not accept that failure as the final word. Legnica in 1241 could have been the end of Poland as a meaningful political entity. The Mongols left the gates of Western Europe wide open. They had eliminated the army that was supposed to protect them. If they had stayed, if Ogedei Khan had not died, if the political winds in Karakorum had blown differently, the history of Central Europe might look profoundly different from what we know today. Different in ways that would cascade through centuries, reshaping the entire arc of European civilization. But they left. And in the silence after the storm, the Polish people did something that every civilization in history has had to do at least once. They chose to learn from the worst thing that had ever happened to them. That is not a small thing. In fact, that might be the most important thing. The willingness to be honest about why you failed. To resist the temptation of comfortable excuses. The numbers were too great. The enemy was invincible. God willed it so. And instead ask, what could we have done differently? What did they know that we didn't? How do we change? This is not a purely military question. It is a civilizational one. And the answer, in Poland's case, came in stone and mortar, and 47 years of patient work. The great commanders in history, the ones who actually change outcomes rather than simply being present when outcomes change, are often not the ones who win the decisive battle. They are the ones who create the conditions for the decisive battle to be possible. The architects, the administrators, the educators of subsequent generations of fighters, the builders of institutions that outlast any single engagement. We don't know the names of most of the people who rebuilt Krakow's walls. We don't know the names of the commanders who developed the doctrine that stopped the Mongol cavalry cold in 1288. They didn't write memoirs. They didn't commission paintings of themselves. They just built walls and taught their students and hoped it would be enough. It was enough. And that should make you think about what kind of walls are worth building in your own life. Not literally, or maybe literally. What do I know about your situation? But in the broader sense, the investments in preparation and resilience and learning from failure that don't look dramatic in the moment, that don't produce immediate results, that require you to think not in weeks, but in decades. The kind of changes that only reveal their value when the real test arrives. History is full of the dramatic moments, the charges, the battles, the decisive confrontations. What history is less good at recording, because it is harder to dramatize, is the patient, unglamorous, essential work that makes those moments possible. The 47 years between Legnica and Kraków were not an absence of history. They were the history. Every stone placed on a wall, every commander who sat down with a map and tried to understand how Mongol cavalry moved, every garrison that practiced holding their position even when everything in them wanted to run. That patient work, done in the shadow of a catastrophic defeat, in the absence of glory, in the grinding reality of rebuilding after total destruction. That is the part of the story that I want you to carry away from this video. Because the lesson of Legnica and Kraków is not really about Poland. It's not even really about the Mongols. It's about what human beings are capable of when they refuse to let the worst chapter be the final chapter. Now I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me, which part of this story hit you hardest? Was it the image of Henry the Pious dying in that field while Bohemian reinforcements were just a day away? The 47 years of quiet rebuilding? The moment those Mongol commanders looked at the walls of Kraków and realized something had changed? Or was it something else? Because I think this story touches something universal, and I want to know which thread pulled at you. And if you want to follow where this kind of history leads, stories about the people and the moments and the decisions that actually shaped the world we're living in, subscribe. Tell your friends about this channel, because the most important history is the kind that's still alive in the world around you. The kind where you can trace a straight line from a medieval battlefield to the city you walked through this morning. The world you inhabit today is the sum of choices made by people who are long dead. Some of those choices were terrible. Some were brilliant. Most were made under pressure, in conditions of uncertainty, by human beings who didn't know how the story would end. In 1241, after Legnica, nobody knew how it would end. But they built walls anyway. And sometimes, that's everything.